All right, welcome to Gospel Backgrounds number 13. This is called New Wineskins, and we're going to be looking at the rest of Luke chapter 5, bits of Matthew 8 and 9, and then the end of Mark 1 and the beginning of Mark 2. Our roadmap for this lesson, first we have a determined leper. So this is a person who breaks quarantine, which was required for someone in his condition. And he approaches Jesus not to be healed from his disease, but to be spiritually cleansed, which is interesting and shows some great insight. Then we have what I'm calling four determined friends. So these friends have a paralytic and they're trying to get to Jesus and they can't because of the crowd. So what they do is they punch a hole in Peter's roof and drop him on down, and he's healed because of their determination. So that's a great story. Next, we have the calling of Matthew, the tax collector, and which results in Matthew throwing a party, which results in some festivities that some disciples of John and possibly some Pharisees disagree with, and they're going to ask some questions about, why aren't you fasting? And then in response, Jesus is going to give what's called the double parable of Luke 5, and that is the new and old clothes and the parable of new and old wineskins. So it's interesting that these topics move in order from more straightforward to more complex. So by topics number 4 and 5, we'll have to do some unpacking here. Well, we start with Acts 17:11, and I'm just going to give you the last part from here on out. We'll say that the Bereans received the word with all eagerness, but they examined the scriptures daily to see whether these things be so. So that's just a reminder. Don't believe what I say, but always check it out with scripture. I'll shut the camera off, and we will look at maps, and then we'll get on into the study. This is an interesting chart showing where we are. So we've had a couple lessons ago, the Pool of Bethesda. Last lesson we talked about Capernaum. We're still in this calling the disciples phase. We're really heading into what is the apex of his Galilean ministry. Many scholars believe that when he retreats to Caesarea Philippi, and that's actually the location of Peter's great confession, that really is the high watermark of sorts of his ministry. And then after that, it is clear what his mission is to make his way up to Jerusalem for the trial, arrest, crucifixion, and then ultimately resurrection. There's a map to get our bearings, and these boxes are according to Schlegel's chronology, which is slightly different than Lancaster's, the one we're using. The blue dashes indicate his potential route of his Galilean ministry. We don't really know. We're not told. Matthew actually has the route ending on the eastern shore, and he takes a boat back to Capernaum to pick up the story. So kind of on that note, there is definite geographic location, but there's also some spiritual significance when it talks about Jesus going over to the other side or crossing over. And I'm going to speak in generalities here, but just to give you some idea, the eastern shore here was largely considered Gentile land. So down here is an area called the Decapolis. Decapolis was generally Gentile. One example is when Jesus cast out the demon into the herd of pigs. The pigs drowned themselves in the Sea of Galilee. Pigs aren't kosher, so Jews would not have been pig farmers generally, not if they were observant anyway. So one indication that this is Gentile. The southwestern shore was considered Hellenistic. Now, Hellenistic were the Jews that kind of wanted the best of both worlds. They wanted to be comfortable in Greek and Roman society. They wanted the finer things in life, but they also wanted to have a toe in the water. So these are kind of the compromisers. Whereas the northern shore, which is where Jesus spent most of his time, these would have been the most observant. So most observant formally trained Jews, as well as what scholars call the Am Haaretz, which is Hebrew for people of the land. So agriculture, those types of people that were just devout and wanted to live their lives and in service to God and that kind of thing. Mark 1, and he said to them, let's go into the next towns that I may preach there also, for that is why I came out. And he went throughout all Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and casting out demons. So he's continuing his work. We know that from history that most times disciples spend about a month away on tour at a time, but other times it could have been much longer. In any case, what Jesus asked for was 100% commitment. He will later tell his disciples that, you have to choose him over father and mother and wife and children. And that sounds harsh,
But if we understand the discipleship of that time, it makes a lot more sense. So again, we don't know whether he went to Magdala or not, but this is a synagogue there that's been excavated. We do know that one famous follower probably came from Magdala, and her name is Mary Magdalene. When he was in one of the cities, there came a man full of leprosy, and when he saw Jesus, he fell on his face and begged him, "Lord, if you will, you can make me clean." Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, "I will, be clean." And immediately the leprosy left him. And he charged him to tell no one, but go and show yourself to the priest, make an offering for your cleansing, as Moses commanded, for a proof to them. But now even more, the report about him went abroad. Great crowds gathered to hear him and to be healed of their infirmities, but he would withdraw to desolate places and pray. Mark actually picks up that he was told to tell no one, but he went out and began to talk freely about it. And my teacher, Chuck Missler, used to rhetorically ask, he told those guys to keep it quiet, and what did they do? And he tells us to tell everybody, and what do most of us do? I see a bit of a contrast here between this leper and the healing at the pool of the Bethesda. That man only wanted physical healing, but our leper here wanted to be spiritually clean more than he wanted to be physically healed. Torah gives a great deal of attention to leprosy. It's these poor guys have what's called Hansen's disease, and that's what we call leprosy. Biblical leprosy was interesting in that it rendered the afflicted spiritually unable to participate. In fact, he was actually spiritually contagious. If he came into contact with a clean person, that person was made unclean as well. So it's interesting that Jesus touched him. While that was probably the first human touch that this person had had in a while, this would have rendered Jesus spiritually unclean as well. And it's not the same as sinning. There's a difference. So we'll look at that in a different slide. There's some application there. Jesus tells him to go and follow the instructions that are outlined in Leviticus 14 by showing yourself to the priest. So again, another example that Jesus had to fulfill every last detail of the law, and he did not come to abolish it. One of the requirements was to clean live birds, and these are two pigeons on the shore of the Dead Sea. We can argue about whether pigeons are clean or not, but at least Levitically they're considered clean. Another offering the afflicted was to bring was hyssop as part of the cleansing ceremony. Hyssop is notably used during the night of Passover. The Israelites were to brush the blood of the lamb on their doorpost with hyssop so the death angel would pass over them. Later in John 19, Jesus says he's thirsty and someone offers him vinegar on a sponge from a stalk of hyssop. When we get to Matthew 11, John the Baptist's disciples will come to him and ask, "Are you the one?" And Jesus will answer, "Go tell John what you hear and see." And then among other indicators, Jesus says that lepers are cleansed. So since leprosy had no known cure, the cleansing of a leper would have provided evidence that the Messianic age was upon us. I usually save application for the end, but I'm going to bring it up here in case it isn't obvious, right? You and I are the leper. We are the one in need of Jesus' touch, Jesus' cleansing, and Jesus' healing. Again, we need to ask why Jesus touched this leper when doing so would have made him ritually unclean. He could have healed him without physical contact, and Lancaster provides an answer and maybe some insight here. Just as Jesus intentionally took upon himself the leper's uncleanliness in order to heal him, so too Jesus intentionally took upon human mortality in order to heal it. He took upon our sin in order to cleanse us of it. He took upon himself human uncleanliness, allowing himself to reach the highest level of ritual contamination by becoming a human corpse in order to save us. So very vivid, but I think it's a great example of peering into the window of first century context ever so slightly gives us a huge insight here. So the more we understand leprosy and the more we understand that we are the leper, that the more that this healing has significance to us personally. One last thing about leprosy, the Jewish sages, even to this day, they associate leprosy with the sin of gossip, and they call it lashon hara, which is the evil tongue. And gossip is just, they consider that sometimes worse than murder because gossip steals and murders someone's good name and good reputation. And the more we gossip, the more rotten and leprous we become inside. So something we need to stay away from. It's a very vivid picture. Verse 17, on one of those days as he was teaching, Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there, who had come from every village of Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was with him to heal. And behold, some men were bringing on a bed a man who was paralyzed, and they were seeking to bring him in and lay him before Jesus. But finding no way to bring him in because of the crowd, they went up on the roof, let him down with his bed through the tiles in the midst before Jesus. And when he saw their faith, he said, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." So I've got some of the place locations in blue, again, to remind us these are real events in real places that we can visit today. Mark 2 verse 1 says after some days, so that implies that Jesus got some rest. So it's very important for those in ministry to kind of recharge the batteries every once in a while, and Jesus in his humanity does exactly that here. Pharisee has kind of a bad connotation, and a lot of that I think is deserved. Some of it may be overgeneralized. 2,000 years later, we may not realize that the term Pharisees is like saying Baptists or Californians, right? Not all Baptists agree on doctrine, and not all Californians talk like surfers. So in the same way, not all Pharisees were corrupt and hypocritical. Definitely some were, but John, the gospel writer, often uses the term Jews and Pharisees to mean a very specific group of people in control of the religious establishment. So that certainly wasn't all Pharisees, and it wasn't all Jews. In this case, the Pharisees were not there to entrap him. They were just kind of curious and wanted to hear what he had to say, and definitely startled at what happens next. But it's interesting that of all this Jewish sects around, sects around in the first century, his teaching most aligns with the Pharisees. In Acts 23, Paul says he says basically he's proud to be a Pharisee. He doesn't say he used to be a Pharisee. He says I am a Pharisee. In Acts 5, there's a famous Pharisee named Gamaliel, who's a famous teacher, pictured in the picture on the screen there. He actually speaks out against the persecution of the Jesus movement in that day. So Paul would have had to go against his own teacher, and Acts 26 says he received authority from the chief priests to carry out his persecution. Well, the chief priests would have been Sadducees, not Pharisees. So obviously there were a lot of Pharisees and a lot of Jews who had problems with Jesus, and a lot who were hypocrites. But my point here is not all of them, were the murderous group and of conspirators and that kind of thing. This is a picture of some of the housing remains in Capernaum. This is not Peter's house, but shows you an example in the yellow box there of steps that the men would have used to carry their friend up and then eventually lower him down into the crowd where Jesus was teaching. Luke says he was let down through tiles. Scholars think that maybe that was so his Greek and Roman audiences could understand. What really happened was they dug a hole. The roofs of Galilee were flat and they were covered with vegetation of some kind and mud. So kind of like the Irish countryside thatch houses, if you've seen that. So they would lay some woodwork down and then lay this thatch on top of it. Another picture of a mat, so just a grass, a woven mat of some kind that could be rolled up and carried away. And the scribes and the Pharisees began to question, saying, "Who is this who speaks blasphemies? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" So remember in verse 20, he's not actually healed yet, he's forgiven, which is what he wanted, right? He wanted to be clean. When Jesus perceived their thoughts, he answered them, "Why do you question in your hearts? Which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven you, or to say rise and walk? But so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins," he said to the man who was paralyzed, "I say to you, pick up your bed and go home." And immediately he rose up before them and picked up what he had been lying on and went home, glorifying God. And amazement seized them all, and they glorified God and were filled with awe, saying, "We have seen extraordinary things to this day." And after this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, "Follow me." And leaving everything, he rose and followed him. And Levi made a great feast in his house, and there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at the table with them. There's a whole lot of background on tax collectors, which I can spare you, except to say that they had the authority of Rome to extract as much over and above the required amount as they could. So you can imagine how well that went over with the people. A Jew working for Rome was bad enough, but given his name was Levi, we can further assume he was a Levite. Now, Levite was supposed to be a cut above in terms of piety and separation and scholarship and that kind of thing, whereas tax collectors were equated with thieves and bandits. They were generally hated. So this, how the mighty have fallen is kind of what we're seeing here. How Levi ended up as basically the equivalent of a used car salesman or whatever, politician or whatever degrading position we would consider today. That's what Levi was. The um, the Jews did not look favorably on their Roman occupiers. It was very tense. One of the reasons that caused this was the insult that they perceived by the use of their currency. So one of the statutes in the Torah was you shall make no graven images. So no images of animals, no images of people. Well, not only did Rome have graven images on their coins, they had pagan pagan gods. So it was basically enforced paganism, which the Jews just, it was token the bearer, to be sure. If we look at Jewish coins, this is from about early second century. There's no graven images. There's a palm tree on one side and a lyre, the musical instrument, on the other, and just some writing of dating and that kind of thing. So back to the Roman coins, that's not just any woman on the left. That is Cybele, the ancient mother of all gods. So this is like putting Mother Earth on a coin that was, pagan and polytheistic and all sorts of things that would have just really offended the Jews. And on the right side is a male figure. It's hard to see, Bacchus, the god of merriment, leaning. He's kneeling and he's holding a camel, and you can see more clearly. But all of this would have just been very highly offensive to the Jewish people. So they wouldn't have wanted to hold these things. They wouldn't have wanted to deal with them, but yet they had to because that was the currency of their occupiers. This is called an ostraca, which is nothing more than a shard of pottery, which was then repurposed for receipts of various kinds. So archaeologists love ostraca. They're more common in the Iron Age than those earlier times than they were in the Roman days, but we still see one. This one's from AD 21, and so basically scholars can date the pottery to find out how old it is, and then of course the writing on the pottery tells them some information too. So remember from our discussion on discipleship that the disciples were not under any hypnotic compulsion, if we want to call it that. So being in Capernaum, Matthew certainly would have had exposure to Jesus and his message. Acts says they were uneducated, but this isn't quite what we think it means. Keener in his commentary notes that they were not trained in Greek rhetoric and possibly not trained under a recognized rabbi. But we can be confident that being a Jew and being a Levite, that Matthew was not unlearned and he didn't just blindly follow Jesus. He had some exposure to him. Verse 30, and the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? And Jesus answered them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. We'll talk a little bit about the dining question on the next slide. There's some interesting things going on here. Matthew picks up, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. We'll talk about that in a future lesson. We'll unpack that a little more. But again, just to be quick, this is often interpreted as Jesus is doing away with the Old Testament sacrificial system, which really makes no sense because he is the one who instituted it. So, if he doesn't make mistakes, basically it's saying that God made a mistake with the sacrificial system, which I don't think happened. I think the context is more likely that we shouldn't get religion over relationship with mercy and compassion and that kind of thing. So again, we'll look at that in a future lesson. Okay, a lot going on with this feast. There's several things, and we'll try and talk a little bit about each one. In the Lexham Geographic Commentary, Phillips notes that from the description of the banquet, Matthew was very wealthy. I mean, it's very clear that he would have been able to afford a large house and have a large feast in that house with all kinds of room and food and that kind of thing. Number two, the issue of dining was obviously a big deal in that society, right? We see this not only here, but in Acts and in Paul's writings. They talk a lot about what is okay and what isn't okay. Can we eat meat sacrificed to idols? Who can we eat with? Paul gets on Peter's case about eating with non-Jews and that kind of thing. The one thing I think we should keep clear is that it wasn't like Jesus came and did away with any of the Torah-based dietary laws. So I don't think they were having ham sandwiches, let's put it that way. I don't think Peter was having a bacon cheeseburger. But what they did do, and we talked about this in a previous lesson, was we do this today. We put hedges up around certain things to protect us from the thing that's even worse, right? So the Bible says, don't be drunk. So in order to protect us from not being drunk, we would impose a law in our church membership, hypothetically speaking, that we forbid our members to drink any alcohol. And that way, if no one drinks any alcohol, then they won't be drunk and they won't violate the Bible that way. But that may be a good idea, but we just need to recognize that we're imposing a rule that's not in the Bible. And by the way, we've just made someone who thinks it's okay in their freedom to enjoy a glass of wine with a meal, and we make them feel like they're doing something wrong and not welcome, right? When we just need to realize that that is not in the Bible. So what the Pharisees did was, in order to avoid eating with unclean people, it ended up being that they imposed standards that they essentially forbid themselves to eat with anyone who wasn't a Pharisee. And so ironically, we turn that around, and that leads some scholars to think that the Pharisees and Jesus had a closer relationship than we might realize. They wouldn't have chided him for eating with non-Pharisees if they didn't think that he was a Pharisee. They wouldn't have invited Jesus over to eat with them, as we see later in Luke. They wouldn't have invited him if they didn't think he was a Pharisee. So there's that play going on that Jesus and the Pharisees might have been more aligned. So of course, I'll be facetious and I'll say this never happens today, right? We never see members of a particular church who only associate with you unless you're a member of that church. And sadly, I'm being facetious. So that's the dietary thing, and I'm sure we'll tackle that later as we go through the Gospels too. Third thing is that Matthew, of all people, would have noticed the influx of people into Capernaum and likely taxed a portion of all of that. I'm sure the thought was, if Jesus can reach a tax collector, he can reach anybody, right? We talked about how the tax collectors were among the lowest in that society. So notice that there's a large company of other tax collectors and sinners, and notice how Matthew was able to be a witness to that group. And so this gives me hope, right? Because whatever bad stuff may have happened in my past, whether it's my own bad choices or the trials that I've endured through no fault of my own, God can use those lessons to teach people who are in a similar situation. So often the road that you may have been on, you can reach people in a way that others who haven't been down that road couldn't do, right? So Matthew, by virtue of his being among the bottom rung of society, he could reach that group in a way that someone who would walk the straight and narrow couldn't have. So anyway, just some thoughts there about this meal. Continuing on, they said to him, the disciples of John, now we're kind of changing gears here a little bit, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. Jesus said to them, can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The day will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days. John's disciples might have been fasting for John to be released from prison, so possibly they were hoping that Jesus would join them in solidarity and keep a fast too. Keener notes in his background commentary that the Pharisees often fasted twice a week, and so we've mentioned at least initially there was some affinity between the Pharisees and Jesus. They may have again been wondering why Jesus was not keeping this particular Pharisaical custom. Jesus uses similar logic as John's disciples, but turned it around. So John's disciples fasted because John was in prison. Jesus is present with his disciples, so it's not appropriate for the disciples to fast while their master is still with them. But he's saying there will come a day when his disciples will fast due to their master being absent, just as John's disciples are now fasting. So when that day comes, Jesus' disciples will fast. So in this mostly chronological arrangement of the Gospels that we're following, this is really the first direct allusion that we have to Jesus' ultimate destiny of suffering and dying on the cross. So kind of all this is the first hint of that right here. It's important to note that Jesus is not issuing a polemic on the Jewish custom of fasting, right? He says they will fast in those days. He says that in verse 35. This will be important as we try to unpack the next two parables. the Protestant wing of Christianity doesn't do a lot with fasting, but really fasting has been an integral part of the Christian faith really since the earliest days. So we're not. A lot of people take this to say Jesus is doing away with fasting, and he's doing nothing of the sort. Jesus says his disciples are to rejoice as if at a wedding banquet, which is actually the exact opposite of mourning time. In fact, wedding feasts required 7 days of feasting, and per Keener, one was not permitted to fast, engage in mourning, or difficult labor during a wedding feast just because it's so inappropriate. So that's interesting. All right, now we wrap up the chapter with what is known as the double parable. Jesus told them a parable. No one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he will tear the new, and the piece from the new will not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the new wine will burst the skins, and it will be spilled, and the skins will be destroyed. But new wine must be put into fresh wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, desires new, for he says the old is good. So we need to look at this from multiple layers. So the surface meaning is that one would never destroy a new garment to repair an old garment. The patch, they won't match, and both garments would be ruined. In the case of the wineskin, the old wineskin had already stretched out because of the fermentation process. So if you take a stretched out bag and you put new wine that's going to ferment further, that already stretched skin would burst under the pressure, and both the wine and the wineskin will be lost. And so new wine is, freshly squeezed. We might call it grape juice. It just has not aged yet. So interesting, verse 39, wine connoisseurs know that old wine is superior. So as an aside, Keener notes in his commentary that the disciples were never drunk or out of control, but they apparently were enjoying themselves with old wine here. And that apparently drew some dirty looks from the other pious groups. And again, we never see that kind of judgment today, do we? Lancaster picked up on an old Jewish proverb. It's in the book of Ecclesiasticus. So if you have a Bible with the Apocrypha in it, it's Ecclesiasticus 9, verse 10. Forsake not an old friend, for the new is not comparable to him. A new friend is as new wine. When it is old, thou shalt drink it with pleasure. So I think that's kind of cute. So again, most Christian commentaries that we're going to read immediately assume the new is Christianity, gospel, grace, and the old is Judaism, law, bad. And Jesus here is saying that the two are incompatible. No one tears a new garment to repair an old one, and so clearly the old Judaism is beyond repair. Trying to take the new covenant gospel and pour it into the old covenant Judaism would only destroy both. The new Christianity is just superior in every way. So as you might expect by now, I have some issues with this view, and so do some of the commentaries I'm reading. So let's unpack these a little bit. So the traditional view of old Judaism bad, new Christianity good has a number of problems. First, in Luke 5:39, Jesus concludes by saying the old is good, right? People prefer the old. So, oops, how can he be saying old Judaism is bad? He just concludes it by saying it's good. The old is good. So there were even some early Christian sects that tried to expunge verse 39 from the records. They try to get it removed from the gospel. So I guess cancel culture is nothing new. So that's one problem. Second, as we talked about before, it's anachronistic. For almost all of the first century, Christianity was a part of Judaism, and Jewish sects, SECTS, often hotly debated each other within the pale of Judaism. This is from a Wikipedia article, quotes Robert Goldenberg as saying at the end of the first century CE, there were not yet two separate religions called Judaism and Christianity. Just a little side note, don't be afraid of CE instead of BC, CE and BCE. The Gregorians actually messed up the calendar anyway because we have Christ being born at year 5 before Christ. So CE is just it's a less offensive way of saying common era and before common era. That's all that means. Another scholar, Daniel Boyarin, Judaism and Christianity were part of one complex religious family for at least 3 centuries. So the split between Judaism and Christianity was a process, not an event that took a long time to unfold. So my point here is the split definitely could not have been what Jesus expected his audience to understand because it just hadn't happened yet. So third, Jesus did not come to destroy or replace Judaism. Remember, he wrote the Old Testament, right? If he had violated one jot or one tittle of the law, he would be disqualified from being the Jewish Messiah. Now, what he did do was he radically transformed and revolutionized his followers' understanding of Judaism, but it's still Judaism. And then the last point, we need to remember in the immediate context, we're talking about fasting and disciples. In Luke 5:35, Jesus says there will come a day when the disciples will fast. So if we're going to follow this replacement view through, the parable would seem to be saying we tear a piece of the old garment, fasting in Judaism, and we put it in the new garment, fasting in Christianity. And this is just nonsensical. It's not what is being said. So we've said what the parables probably do not mean. Let's take a look at what the parables might mean. For this, we need to peek into the window of a document that is included in what is called Pirkei Avot, and it is Avot is the name for fathers, and Pirkei means like wisdom or teaching or things like that. There was a proverb that talked about wineskins as disciples and new and old wine as teachings. And I'll link to what that is in case if you want to go read the whole thing, you can. So we're following Luke's chronology, and we have to keep in mind the context. The context is the four main disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, have just been called. Jesus has just added Matthew. They're at a feast, and now he gets a question about his disciples' behavior with respect to other disciples. So remember this proverb that talked about wineskin as disciples. Could it be that that is Jesus' point of reference? He's referencing something that they all would have known that we're just not that familiar with. So this is something that Daniel Lancaster discovered and picked up. And as he was researching, he came across another commentary by a Yechiel Shvi Lichtenstein, who lived in the 19th century and came up with the same thought. So here it is in a nutshell, and I'm boiling this down to a few bullet points, but really there's pages and pages of commentary to be poured through here. What this parable is saying is Jesus is explaining why he chose these disciples who do things differently. Remember, new wineskin is wineskins in general are disciples, and the new and old wine are teaching. So kind of keep that in mind. So the new garment is the new wineskin are Jesus' disciples. He selected men that other teachers probably passed over. And in fact, they were considered to be unlearned because they were not as sophisticated, and maybe they didn't come up through the proper schools, the Stanford and Harvard, they went to, some other junior high or junior college or whatever. Old garment and wineskin are disciples who had studied under another teacher, such as John the Baptist or a prominent rabbi of that day. The new wine or a new patch is Jesus' new teaching or interpretation of Torah. Jesus didn't, he really redefined the application of Torah that had kind of gotten off track by the teachers of that day. So Jesus kind of really did a course correction on that, which started a lot of people, and a lot of people just couldn't buy into it. Old wine would be those previously held to teachings, things that get passed on almost without question. We see that in the church today. Something Luther said just get passed on and passed on and passed on. It's like, well, wait a minute, was Luther right? And you look back and he actually wasn't right. So he was right about a lot of things, but a couple things he was really wrong about. And I could say the same about Calvin or MacArthur or any of these guys. They're great guys, but none of us are right 100% of the time. So the gist is Jesus is explaining why he chose these specific Talmudim. Jesus' new interpretation and application of Torah, we know, was rejected by the old guard. So think about it. If he had chosen disciples that were a part of this old guard aristocracy, if you will, they likely would have, battled him on these new teachings, and he wouldn't have been able to pour into them. Whereas the disciples he chose had empty canvases. They didn't come up through, the Harvard prep school and Harvard divinity school or whatever we're talking about. He could pour into them, and ultimately they changed the world because they had an open mind and just kind of the lack of preconceptions. So ultimately, the parable is saying you can't teach an old dog new tricks. Now, is this right? I don't know. To me, it fits the context a whole lot better than saying the old garment is Judaism and the new garment is Christianity, because that's completely out of context. Whereas at least this is okay. We're talking about disciples and teaching and wineskin and all that. So it's tough because we just don't have that background that his audience would have had, which is part of the reason I'm doing this series, is to peek into that window just a little bit. So I hope I didn't go too fast. There's a lot of unpacking that needs to happen with this one. But if you need to, you can back up and listen to the explanation again, or check out some of the references that I have. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll conclude the study, and I'll pick up with some application thoughts on the next slide. So instead of questions, I have just reflections, and kind of see what you think about these. So too often I am a leper. I'm unclean and I'm full of gossip, but at least I know where to go to get clean, and the more I do that, the better. Too often I'm the critical Pharisee who won't eat with others that aren't like me. Too often I am the old wineskin. I'm set in my ways and inflexible. More often I need to be the paralytic's friend, someone who's willing to shoulder his burdens and carry him where he needs to go, and most importantly, lead him to Jesus. More often, I need to minister to those who are going down a tough road I've already been down. More often, I need to realize that I am Matthew. I'm rescued, repaired, and rejoicing. So with that, I will leave it here, and we will see you on the next lesson.